Imagine you are standing in the marble corridors of the Palatine Hill on a cold March morning in 59 CE, and you hear something that makes your blood freeze. The deliberate, measured footsteps of Praetorian guards echoing through the imperial palace, their bronze-studded sandals striking the polished stone with the rhythm of approaching death. You know, as every Roman knows, that when the emperor's personal guard moves with such purpose in the pre-dawn darkness, someone powerful is about to die. What you cannot yet comprehend is that, this morning, those footsteps herald the end of the most dangerous woman in the Roman Empire, a mother who dared to control an emperor and who will pay for that audacity with her life in the most brutal way imaginable. Agrippina the Younger was not merely another victim of imperial violence. She was the architect of her own destruction, a woman whose unprecedented accumulation of power challenged the very foundations of Roman patriarchy and ultimately signed her own death warrant. Born into the Julio-Claudian dynasty in 15 CE, she emerged from a world where women were expected to be silent ornaments, yet she wielded influence that would make seasoned senators tremble. Her story represents the ultimate paradox of Roman imperial power, how the system that elevated certain women to godlike status simultaneously ensured their complete vulnerability to the whims of absolute rulers. The daughter of the beloved General Germanicus and the formidable Agrippina the Elder, she inherited a legacy of both glory and tragedy that would define every moment of her existence. Her bloodline carried the weight of imperial expectations and the curse of political ambition that had already claimed her father and would eventually consume her mother. From childhood, she understood that survival in the imperial family required not just intelligence and beauty, but a willingness to embrace moral compromises that would destroy ordinary souls. She learned to navigate a world where love was a weapon, marriage was a political transaction, and motherhood was the ultimate tool of dynastic manipulation. What makes Agrippina's story particularly horrifying is not just the violence of her end, but the systematic way she was forced to participate in her own dehumanization. The Roman imperial system created a grotesque theater where women like Agrippina were simultaneously worshipped as near goddesses and treated as expendable pawns in masculine power games. She was educated to be brilliant, trained to be seductive, and groomed to be ruthless, all in service of a system that would ultimately consume her with the same casual brutality it applied to common slaves. The approaching footsteps in that palace corridor represent more than just the end of one woman's life. They symbolize the inevitable conclusion of a system that promised women power while ensuring they could never truly possess it. Agrippina's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about imperial Rome, that even its most privileged women lived in a state of perpetual terror, knowing that their elevated status made them not safer, but infinitely more vulnerable to the capricious violence of absolute power. The transformation of Agrippina from imperial princess to ruthless power broker began with a series of calculated brutalities that would have broken lesser souls, but instead forged her into something far more dangerous. A woman who understood that in Rome, survival required becoming the very monster you feared most. Her early life reads like a masterclass in systematic psychological conditioning, where every loss, every betrayal, and every moment of terror was carefully orchestrated to create the perfect imperial instrument of ambition and revenge. When Agrippina was just 4 years old, she watched her father Germanicus die in agony, his body racked with the unmistakable symptoms of poison, vomiting blood, convulsions, and the slow dissolution of his internal organs while physicians stood helplessly by. But this was not merely the loss of a beloved parent, it was her first lesson in the currency of imperial power. She learned that even the most popular and capable men could be eliminated with a few drops of the right substance, and that tears were a luxury that imperial women could not afford. The sight of her father's lifeless body, once strong enough to command legions, now reduced to a pale shell, taught her that physical strength meant nothing in a world where power flowed through poison rings and whispered conspiracies. The education that followed her father's death was designed to create the perfect imperial woman, beautiful, intelligent, and utterly ruthless. She was taught to read not just Latin and Greek literature, but the subtle language of facial expressions that could reveal treachery before it struck. Her tutors instructed her in the art of conversation that could seduce senators and the mathematics of political alliance that could topple dynasties. But perhaps most importantly, she learned to compartmentalize her humanity, to smile while planning destruction, and to embrace others while calculating their usefulness. This was not education in any meaningful sense. It was the systematic creation of a human weapon. Her first marriage to Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus revealed the true horror of imperial women's existence, the complete absence of choice in the most intimate aspects of their lives. She was handed over to a man known for his cruelty and sexual deviance, a brute who treated her not as a wife, but as a breeding vessel for future imperial heirs. The marriage bed became a site of sanctioned violence, where her body was not her own, and her desires were irrelevant to the dynastic calculations of older men. She bore him a son, the future Emperor Nero. But the pregnancy and birth occurred within a context of such profound powerlessness that motherhood itself became another form of imprisonment. The psychological impact of this systematic dehumanization cannot be overstated. Agrippina learned to survive by becoming what the system demanded, a creature of pure calculation who could manipulate emotions she no longer fully felt. She developed the ability to love strategically, to grieve performatively, and to plan murders with the same attention to detail that other women might apply to household management. The Roman imperial system had succeeded in its grotesque project. It had taken a young girl with natural intelligence and affection and transformed her into something that could function within its moral vacuum. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Agrippina's conditioning was how it was presented as privilege and opportunity. She was told she was fortunate to receive such extensive education, lucky to marry into powerful families, and blessed to bear children who might rule the world. The system convinced her that her suffering was actually success, that her powerlessness was really influence, and that her dehumanization was actually elevation. This psychological manipulation was so complete that she began to see her own victimization as evidence of her superiority over other women, creating a twisted form of Stockholm syndrome that bound her ever more tightly to the very forces that were destroying her. The moment Agrippina set her sights on Emperor Claudius, she initiated what would become one of history's most calculated and morally devastating campaigns of seduction, a systematic assault on an aging man's loneliness and vulnerability that would ultimately place her at the very pinnacle of Roman power, while simultaneously ensuring her eventual destruction. What makes this episode particularly horrifying is not just the cold manipulation involved, but the way it reveals how the imperial system transformed natural human emotions like love, desire, and companionship into weapons of political warfare. Claudius, despite his position as the most powerful man in the world, was profoundly isolated and desperate for genuine affection. His physical disabilities, the trembling hands, the dragging foot, the involuntary head movements, had made him an object of ridicule throughout his life, even within his own family. When Agrippina approached him, she understood exactly how to exploit this deep well of insecurity and longing. She presented herself not as the calculating political operative she had become, but as a woman who could see past his physical limitations to appreciate his intellectual gifts and emotional needs. This was manipulation of the most intimate and cruel variety, the weaponization of human vulnerability. The seduction campaign that followed was a masterpiece of psychological warfare disguised as romance. Agrippina studied Claudius with the intensity of a general preparing for battle, learning his routines, his fears, his intellectual interests, and his emotional triggers. She positioned herself in places where he would encounter her naturally, always appearing at moments when he was most likely to be receptive to companionship. She engaged him in conversations about history and literature, subjects where his genuine expertise could shine, while subtly reinforcing her own intelligence and cultural sophistication. Every interaction was carefully choreographed to make him feel both desired and intellectually respected, two experiences that had been largely absent from his life. But the true horror of Agrippina's campaign becomes clear when we understand the systematic way she eliminated obstacles to her goal. Her previous husband's death, whether from natural causes or more sinister means, had conveniently freed her for this imperial pursuit. She cultivated relationships with Claudius's freedmen and advisors, understanding that access to the emperor required navigating the complex web of influence that surrounded him. She presented gifts and performed favors that created networks of obligation and loyalty. Most disturbing of all, she began positioning her son Nero as a potential heir, calculating how to use maternal love as a tool for dynastic advancement. The marriage itself, when it finally occurred in 49 CE, represented the complete triumph of Agrippina's calculated approach to power acquisition. She had successfully convinced Claudius to change Roman law, which had previously forbidden marriage between uncle and niece, to accommodate their union. This was not merely a personal victory. It was a fundamental alteration of Roman legal tradition to serve one woman's ambition. The wedding ceremony was a grotesque spectacle where genuine emotion was entirely absent, replaced by the cold theater of political alliance disguised as romantic love. Once established as empress, Agrippina's true nature became horrifyingly apparent. She had not sought marriage for companionship or even personal security. She had pursued it as a stepping stone to absolute power. She began systematically eliminating rivals, both real and imagined, while positioning herself as Claudius's primary advisor and confidant. The man who had been starved for affection found himself increasingly isolated from everyone except the woman who had so expertly manipulated his loneliness. The very qualities that had made him vulnerable to her seduction, his intelligence, his need for emotional connection, his physical insecurities, became the tools she used to control and ultimately destroy him. What makes this episode particularly tragic is how it reveals the complete corruption of human relationships within the imperial system. Love, marriage, and family, the fundamental bonds that typically provide meaning and security, had been transformed into instruments of political warfare. Agrippina's success in seducing Claudius was not a triumph of feminine power, but rather evidence of how thoroughly the imperial system had corrupted even the most basic human emotions, turning them into weapons in an endless struggle for survival and dominance. The relationship between Agrippina and her son Nero represents perhaps the most psychologically disturbing dynamic in all of Roman imperial history. A grotesque perversion of maternal love that transformed the sacred bond between mother and child into an instrument of mutual destruction. What began as natural maternal ambition evolved into something far more sinister, a systematic campaign to create and control a puppet emperor that would ultimately consume both mother and son in its horrific logic. From the moment of Nero's birth, Agrippina saw her child not as a person to be loved and nurtured, but as a vehicle for her own political ambitions. She understood that as a woman, she could never rule Rome directly, but through her son, she might wield imperial power more completely than any woman in Roman history. This calculation required her to suppress every natural maternal instinct that might interfere with her political objectives. She could not simply love Nero. She had to shape him, control him, and ultimately use him as an extension of her own will. The education and upbringing that Agrippina orchestrated for her son was a masterclass in psychological manipulation disguised as maternal care. She selected tutors not based on their ability to develop Nero's character or wisdom, but on their willingness to reinforce her own influence over him. She encouraged his artistic interests not because she valued creativity, but because she understood that a son absorbed in poetry and performance would be more dependent on her for political guidance. Every aspect of his development was calculated to create a brilliant but fundamentally weak ruler who would remain forever under her control. When Claudius died, almost certainly poisoned by Agrippina herself, she moved with breathtaking speed to place her 16-year-old son on the imperial throne. The transition was orchestrated with such precision that it revealed years of careful planning. She had cultivated relationships with key Praetorian guards, secured the loyalty of influential freedmen, and eliminated potential rivals before they could even recognize the threat. But perhaps most disturbing was how she presented this coup to Nero himself, not as the result of matricidal murder and political conspiracy, but as the natural fulfillment of his destiny as her beloved son. The early years of Nero's reign represented the peak of Agrippina's power, but also the beginning of her ultimate downfall. She had achieved something unprecedented in Roman history: effective rule through maternal influence. She attended Senate meetings, appeared on coins alongside her son, and made decisions that affected the entire empire. Yet this very success contained the seeds of her destruction because it required her to maintain absolute control over a young man who was gradually discovering his own capacity for independent action. The psychological dynamics of their relationship became increasingly toxic as Nero matured. Agrippina had created a monster of dependency and resentment, a son who both needed her approval and hated her for that need. She had taught him that power was the only thing that mattered, but she had also made it clear that his power was contingent on her continued influence. This created an impossible situation where Nero could not fully become emperor without destroying the very person who had made his reign possible. The turning point came when Nero began to assert his independence through increasingly erratic and violent behavior. His affair with the freedwoman Claudia Acte, his growing interest in public performance, and his tendency toward cruel spectacles were all, in their way, acts of rebellion against his mother's control. But Agrippina, who had invested everything in her ability to manage her son, could not allow him to slip from her grasp. She began to threaten him with exposure of the circumstances surrounding Claudius's death, not understanding that she was essentially threatening a man who had learned from her that murder was an acceptable solution to political problems. The final phase of their relationship was characterized by a series of escalating threats and counter-threats that revealed how completely both mother and son had been corrupted by the imperial system. Agrippina's maternal love had been so thoroughly weaponized that she could no longer distinguish between protecting her son and controlling him. Meanwhile, Nero's filial obligation had been so twisted by years of manipulation that he could only conceive of independence through matricide. The Roman imperial system had succeeded in corrupting even the most fundamental human relationship. transforming the bond between mother and child into a death struggle between two equally damaged souls. The murder of Agrippina the Younger in 59 CE represents not merely the death of one woman, but the logical culmination of a system so thoroughly corrupted that it could only resolve the tension between maternal ambition and imperial power through the most intimate form of violence imaginable: a son's calculated murder of his own mother. The horror of this event lies not just in its brutality, but in how it reveals the complete moral collapse that absolute power inevitably produces, even within the sacred bonds of family. The planning of Agrippina's assassination demonstrates the depths of psychological corruption that the imperial system had achieved. Nero, advised by his counselors Seneca and Burrus, initially attempted to poison his mother, the same method she had likely used against Claudius. When poison failed, due to Agrippina's own precautions born from years of similar plots, they devised increasingly elaborate schemes. They created a collapsible boat designed to drown her during a pleasure cruise, but when she survived the shipwreck through her own strength and swimming ability, they finally resorted to the most direct method, sending assassins to beat her to death in her own villa. The final moments of Agrippina's life encapsulate the tragic irony of her entire existence. When the assassins arrived at her Baiae villa, she understood immediately what was happening. According to historical accounts, she faced her killers with the same calculated composure that had characterized her entire political career. Her last words, reportedly directing the soldiers to strike her womb, "Strike here, for this bore Nero," represent both a final act of defiance and a bitter acknowledgement of how her own maternal body had become the instrument of her destruction. She had spent her life using motherhood as a tool for power, and now that same motherhood would be literally destroyed by the child she had created and controlled. The aftermath of Agrippina's murder reveals the complete moral bankruptcy of the imperial system and its ability to normalize even the most unthinkable acts of violence. Nero's initial reaction was not grief or horror at what he had done, but relief and paranoid fear that his mother's spirit might return to haunt him. The Roman elite, rather than expressing outrage at this unprecedented act of matricide, largely celebrated the removal of a woman who had accumulated too much power. The Senate sent congratulations to Nero for surviving his mother's treachery, while poets and historians began crafting narratives that justified the murder as necessary for the stability of the empire. What makes Agrippina's death particularly horrifying is how it demonstrates the complete failure of all the strategies she had employed for survival and advancement. Her intelligence, her political acumen, her careful cultivation of alliances, her manipulation of masculine desire, none of these sophisticated tools could protect her from the fundamental vulnerability that the imperial system imposed on all women, regardless of their apparent power. She had played the game better than anyone before her, accumulating influence that would have been unimaginable for previous generations of Roman women. Yet she ended up as dead as any common slave who had displeased their master. The legacy of Agrippina's life and death extends far beyond the boundaries of ancient Rome, offering a chilling preview of how systems of absolute power inevitably corrupt even the most fundamental human relationships. Her story demonstrates that when power becomes the only currency that matters, every human bond, maternal love, filial duty, marital partnership, friendship, becomes weaponized and ultimately destroyed. The Roman Empire's treatment of Agrippina reveals a society that had achieved unprecedented wealth, cultural sophistication, and territorial control, but had lost the basic moral foundations that make civilization meaningful. Perhaps most disturbing of all is how Agrippina's story has been largely forgotten or misunderstood by subsequent generations. She is often dismissed as merely another ambitious woman who overreached rather than recognized as a victim of a system that offered women the illusion of power while ensuring their ultimate powerlessness. Her intelligence, courage, and political skill have been overshadowed by moral judgments that ignore the impossible circumstances in which she was forced to operate. The silence surrounding her story represents a continuation of the same forces that killed her, a refusal to acknowledge the systematic violence that absolute power inflicts on those it claims to elevate. The footsteps that echoed through the palace corridors on that March morning in 59 CE were not just announcing the death of Agrippina the Younger, they were marking the moment when the Roman Empire revealed the full extent of its moral corruption. In murdering the woman who had most successfully navigated its treacherous politics, the system demonstrated that even perfect adaptation to its demands offered no protection from its ultimate brutality. Agrippina's story serves as an eternal warning about the price of absolute power, not just for those who wield it, but for those who dare to challenge, control, or even successfully serve it.